The air in the Missouri Ozarks in late October of 1918 was thick with the scent of wood smoke and decay. It was a smell that clung to everything, a constant, cloying reminder of the two great specters haunting the nation, the Great War raging across the sea, and the Spanish flu, the silent killer that had crept into the most isolated hollows. But on the morning a neighbor crested the ridge overlooking the Sawyer farm, the smell was different. It was the smell of stillness. The unnatural silence of a place where life should be bustling. No smoke curled from the chimney of the modest farmhouse. No chickens scratched in the yard. The family mule, Old Bess, stood untethered in the half-plowed field, her head hung low, a silent, forlorn statue. The neighbor, a man named Silas Kane, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The Sawyers were good people, hardworking and quiet, but the flu was indiscriminate. He approached the house, his calls of Jedediah, Elara, echoing unanswered in the crisp autumn air. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging on a single rusty hinge with a low, rhythmic creak that sounded like a weary sigh. Pushing it open, Silas stepped into a scene frozen in time, a tableau of domestic life abruptly and horrifyingly interrupted. 3 bowls of oatmeal sat on the rough-hewn wooden table, a skin formed over their cold, lumpy surfaces. A child's tin soldier lay on its side near the hearth, as if dropped in a moment of sudden alarm. The entire house was eerily clean, eerily quiet. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood. The Sawyer family, Jedediah, his wife Elara, and their 8-year-old son Samuel, had simply vanished. They had been swallowed whole by the oppressive silence of the hills, but they had left one thing behind. On the floor, nestled beside the fallen soldier, was a single sheet of paper. It was a child's drawing, rendered in charcoal from the fireplace. And its contents were the beginning of a cold case so disturbing, so macabre, it would be whispered about in the Ozark Hills for the next 100 years. A forbidden story of the boy who saw too much. The drawing was the first piece of evidence in a puzzle that had no solution. It was the frantic, unskilled work of a child, yet it possessed a chilling clarity. The paper depicted several tall, stick-like figures standing in a circle in a dense forest of jagged, black trees. This alone was not unusual, but it was the heads of the figures that made Silas Kane's blood run cold. They were not human. Atop the stick-like bodies were the heads of animals, a stag with sprawling antlers, a feral hog with sharp tusks, a grim-faced goat, and a raven with a cruel, hooked beak. In the center of their circle was something that looked like a crude altar made of stone, and on it a shape that was vaguely, horribly human. Young Samuel Sawyer had not drawn a child's fantasy. He had drawn a nightmare. The local sheriff, a weary, overworked man named Beaumont, arrived later that day. He glanced at the drawing with a dismissive frown, attributing it to an overactive imagination, perhaps fever-induced. The flu, he reasoned, worked in strange ways. It could make people delirious, cause them to wander off into the woods in a confused daze, seeking a cool spring or simply trying to escape the fever that burned within them. It was a tragic but increasingly common story. The Sawyers, he declared, had likely succumbed to the pandemic, their bodies now lying undiscovered somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded their farm. It was the simplest explanation, the one that required the least amount of work and asked the fewest uncomfortable questions. He folded the drawing, tucked it into his pocket, and officially closed the inquiry before it had even truly begun. But the image was seared into the minds of the few who had seen it, the animal-headed men. The stone altar. It spoke of something far older and far more sinister than any disease. It was a vision of a primordial evil, something that belonged to the deepest, darkest parts of the Ozark folklore, a folklore the town elders of nearby Blackwood Creek worked very hard to keep buried. The case of the vanished family was officially closed, but for those who lived in the hollows, it was the start of a horrifying new chapter, a cold case born from a forbidden secret. To understand the terror that took the Sawyer family, you must first understand the world they inhabited. The year 1918 was a time of profound anxiety. The young men of the Missouri Ozarks were being shipped off to die in the muddy trenches of France, leaving behind farms tended by women, children, and old men. Letters from the front were rare and often brought devastating news. But a more insidious enemy had arrived on their shores, an enemy that required no ships or guns. The Spanish flu, or the Purple Death as it was sometimes known, moved like a phantom through the isolated communities. It was a terror, or that bred paranoia. People began to eye their neighbors with suspicion. A simple cough could make you a pariah. Families would bar their doors, trusting no one, as the illness swept through homes, often taking entire households in a matter of days. In this atmosphere of fear and loss, the remote and insular nature of the Ozark Hills became a crucible for superstition. For generations, these hills had been a place of refuge for beliefs and practices that had long since faded from the modern world. Folk magic, whispered curses, and tales of things that lurked in the deep woods were not just stories told around a fire. For many, they were a fundamental part of their reality. The people of Blackwood Creek and its surrounding hollows were a community bound by blood, secrets, and a deep-seated distrust of outsiders. They relied on their own remedies, their own justice, and their own faith, a faith that was often a strange and unsettling mixture of old-world paganism and fire-and-brimstone Christianity. They believed the woods were alive, that certain creeks held ancient power, and that pacts could be made with unseen forces to ensure a good harvest or ward off disease. Into this world of simmering dread and dark belief, the Sawyer family had arrived just 2 years prior. They were outsiders, seeking a quiet life away from the growing cities. They were good, honest people, but they did not understand the unwritten rules of the hills. They did not know the history that was buried beneath the soil they now tilled, a history that was far from dead. Jedediah Sawyer was a man of logic and toil. He had moved his family from the outskirts of St. Louis, seeking clean air and the promise of self-sufficiency. He believed in the power of his own two hands, in the turning of the seasons, and in a God who was distant but just. He had little time for what he called the hill gossip, the hushed stories of witches in the woods or the strange lights seen dancing over Copperhead Ridge on moonless nights. His wife, Elara, was more sensitive to the atmosphere of their new home. She noticed the way their neighbors would sometimes fall silent when she approached, the strange, almost protective symbols carved into the doorframes of their homes, made from bundled twigs and twine. She heard the whispers about certain families in town, the founding families of Blackwood Creek, who were said to be different, who held a power that was older than the church steeple that pierced the sky. Their son, 8-year-old Samuel, was a quiet and observant boy. He spent his days exploring the woods that bordered their property, a vast and ancient forest that seemed to press in on their small farm from all sides. He was fascinated by the strange rock formations, the gnarled trees that looked like petrified old men, and the eerie silence of the deeper groves. It was during one of these solitary explorations, in the week before his family vanished, that Samuel's quiet world was shattered. He came home one afternoon just as the sun was setting, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that his parents had never seen before. He was trembling, unable to speak at first, his small hands clenched into tight fists. When he finally found his voice, it was a choked whisper, a story so bizarre, so unbelievable, that Jedediah immediately dismissed it as a child's nightmare brought on by the feverish tales he'd overheard from local children. Samuel spoke of seeing men in the woods, deep in a hidden clearing he'd stumbled upon. But they weren't normal men, he insisted. They were wearing the heads of animals, and they were dancing around a large, flat rock stained dark with something that looked like rust in the fading light. He had seen too much. "Nonsense, son," Jedediah had said, his voice firm but gentle as he knelt before his trembling child. "It was just a shadow playing tricks on your eyes, or maybe a bad dream you had." Elara, however, was not so quick to dismiss it. She saw the genuine, gut-wrenching fear in her son's eyes. This was not the fabrication of a playful mind. It was the raw terror of a witness. She held Samuel close, trying to soothe him, but his body remained rigid with fright. Over the next few days, a change came over the boy. The once adventurous child became withdrawn and fearful. He refused to go outside alone, staying within sight of the farmhouse at all times. He began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming from nightmares he couldn't or wouldn't describe. His only outlet was his drawing. He would sit for hours by the fire, a piece of charcoal clutched in his hand, sketching the same horrifying scene over and over again. The circle of trees, the animal-headed men, the stone altar. Jedediah grew frustrated, believing his son's fixation to be unhealthy. He forbade the drawings, hoping to force the disturbing images from Samuel's mind. But the act of banning the art only seemed to drive the fear deeper. Samuel would hide his doctor awings, tucking them away beneath a loose floorboard in his small bedroom, a secret gallery of the macabre. What the Sawyers didn't realize was that Samuel's nightmare had been noticed. His presence in the woods that day had not gone unseen. The isolated Sawyer farm was now under a silent, invisible scrutiny. The rustling in the woods at night was no longer just the wind. The snap of a twig in the darkness was no longer just a wandering deer. They were being watched by the very figures from Samuel's drawings, their quiet life now balanced on the knife's edge of a forbidden secret. The boy had stumbled upon something that was never meant for outside eyes, a dark covenant that had governed the fortunes of Blackwood Creek for generations. And for that transgression, a price would have to be paid. The signs began subtly, small intrusions into the rhythm of their farm life. A prize-winning hen found dead in its coop, not torn apart by a predator, but with its neck neatly and unnervingly snapped. Jedediah blamed a fox, but the clean, deliberate nature of the kill felt wrong. A few days later, he discovered a strange symbol carved into the bark of the large oak tree that stood at the edge of their property line. It was a complex, geometric shape, like a twisted star inside a circle, etched deep into the wood with a sharp blade. It wasn't a brand he recognized, nor did it resemble any of the simple markings used by local loggers. It felt ancient, imbued with a purpose he could not comprehend. Alara found a bundle of black feathers and animal bones tied together with red twine hanging from the handle of their well pump one morning. She tore it down with a shudder, throwing it into the fire, but the image of it lingered in her mind. It felt like a warning, a piece of dark folk magic left on their doorstep. These incidents, taken alone, could be dismissed as strange coincidences or the work of mischievous local youths, but woven together, they created a tapestry of escalating dread. The sense of being watched was constant, a palpable pressure on the back of their necks whenever they stepped outside. The woods, once a place of solace for Jedediah and adventure for Samuel, now seemed to hold its breath as they passed, its shadows deeper, its silence more menacing. The family began to live under a state of siege. Jedediah started carrying his rifle with him as he did his daily chores. Alara bolted the doors and windows at dusk, long before the sun had fully set. Samuel, haunted by what he had seen, would spend hours staring out the window, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of the animal-headed men he knew were out there. The Sawyer family was being deliberately isolated, psychologically tormented by an unseen enemy. It was a slow, creeping horror designed to break them, to make them understand the gravity of their son's trespass before the final, horrifying act was carried out. Jedediah Sawyer was not a man easily intimidated, but the relentless, silent pressure was beginning to wear on him. The final straw came with the mule. He found Old Bess one morning, not dead but marked. The same twisted, star-like symbol that was carved into the oak tree had been crudely painted on the animal's flank using what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The mule was trembling, her eyes wide with terror, as if she too had seen a phantom in the night. This was no prank. This was a direct, terrifying message. Jedediah, his face a grim mask of anger and fear, decided he could no longer remain silent. He hitched the mule to his cart and made the journey into the small, claustrophobic town of Blackwood Creek. The town was huddled in a valley, a collection of tired-looking wooden buildings shadowed by the surrounding hills. As Jedediah walked down the main dirt street towards the sheriff's office, he felt the weight of eyes on him. Faces peered from behind lace curtains. Men conversing on the porch of the general store fell silent, their gazes following him with a cold, unreadable intensity. He was an outsider and he was bringing trouble. Sheriff Beaumont listened to Jedediah's story with a practiced air of weary patience. He examined the symbol Jedediah had sketched on a piece of paper, his expression unreadable. "It's kids, Jedediah," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "Probably from the ridge. They get bored, they get mean, trying to spook the new family." But there was no conviction in his words. When Jedediah pressed, speaking of the constant surveillance, the fear that had taken root in his home, the sheriff's eyes hardened. "You're letting your boys' fantasies get the better of you," he warned, his tone shifting from dismissive to menacing. "These are tense times. People are on edge because of the sickness. My advice to you is to go home, lock your doors, and stop seeing monsters in every shadow. Some things in these hills are best left alone." It was a clear, unambiguous threat. The law in Blackwood Creek was not there to protect him. It was there to protect the town's secrets. Jedediah left the office with a dawning horror. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The visit to the sheriff was a grave miscalculation. Jedediah had hoped for assistance, for some semblance of law and order. Instead, he had confirmed the town's suspicions. He had marked his family as a problem, as people who would not quietly accept the strange occurrences in the hills. The journey back to the farm was fraught with a new kind of dread. The silence of the woods was no longer passive. It was active, malevolent. He felt as if he had walked into a spider's web and by struggling had only alerted the spider to his presence. When he arrived home, he found Alara in a state of near panic. While he was gone, a man had come to the farm, not to the door but to the edge of the woods. He was a tall, gaunt figure dressed in the simple clothes of a farmer, but his face was one she recognized from town. It was Mr. Abernathy, one of the town elders, a patriarch of one of Blackwood Creek's founding families. He hadn't said a word. He simply stood there at the tree line, watching the house for nearly an hour. His presence was a silent, powerful message, an act of psychological warfare that was far more terrifying than any spoken threat. Abernathy was a man whose family was whispered to have deep roots in the old ways, a man whose influence in the town was absolute. His silent vigil was a clear sign. The Sawyers had crossed a line. That night the atmosphere in the small farmhouse was thick with a suffocating fear. The family ate their meager supper in silence, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through them. They were prisoners in their own home. After putting a restless Samuel to bed, Jedediah and Alara sat at the table, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was then that Alara, her voice barely a whisper, made a chilling suggestion. "The drawings," she said, her eyes wide. Maybe Samuel didn't just imagine it. Maybe it's real. Jedediah, what if the stories they tell about this place? What if they're true?" Jedediah, a man who had built his life on the solid foundations of reason, found his worldview crumbling. The evidence was irrefutable. The escalating threats, the sheriff's veiled warning, Abernathy's silent intimidation, it all pointed to a conspiracy of silence, a community hiding a dark and terrible secret. A secret his 8-year-old son had accidentally uncovered. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of the impossible. Men with animal heads, rituals in the woods. It sounded like the ravings of a madman, yet the fear it inspired was chillingly real. He thought back to the strange, hushed conversations he'd overheard at the general store, talks of the old ways, and the pact that kept Blackwood Creek safe and prosperous, even as surrounding towns withered. He had dismissed it as ignorant superstition. Now he wondered if it was something far more literal, far more macabre. He retrieved Samuel's hidden drawings from beneath the floorboard. Spreading them out on the table, he and Alara examined them under the flickering lantern light. They were more than just childish scribbles. There was a horrifying consistency to them. The same number of figures, the same animal heads, the same stone altar. In one drawing, Samuel had added something new, a crescent moon hanging in the sky, tinged with a faint red color. A blood moon. Jedediah remembered the almanac. He checked the date. The next blood moon, a full lunar eclipse, was just 2 nights away. A cold, sickening realization washed over him. Whatever Samuel had witnessed, it wasn't a random event. It was part of a cycle, a ceremony tied to celestial events. and the next ceremony was imminent. The Sawyers were no longer just inconvenient witnesses to a past event. They were now a dangerous liability on the eve of a new one. Their time was running out. The slow, creeping campaign of terror was about to escalate into its final, horrifying phase. The following day, a profound and eerie quiet descended upon the Sawyer farm. The campaign of overt intimidation ceased. There were no strange symbols, no silent watchers at the tree line. This absence of threat was, in its own way, more terrifying than the threats themselves. It was the calm before a storm, the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes. Jedediah and Alara knew they had to flee. There was no one to turn to, no authority to appeal to. Their only hope was to pack what they could, abandon the farm and their dreams, and disappear into the night before the blood moon rose. They spent the day in a flurry of hushed, frantic activity. Alara packed clothes and what little food they had, her movements quick and jerky. Jedediah prepared the cart, checking the wheels and harnessing the terrified mule, whose eyes still rolled with a panicked white. Samuel, understanding that something terrible was about to happen, remained silent, a small, pale ghost in his own home. He clutched the tin soldier in his hand, his only remaining comfort in a world that had become a living nightmare. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, casting the Ozark hills in shades of purple and orange, Jedediah made one final, fateful decision. He could not leave without some form of proof, some record of what had happened to them. He feared that if they simply vanished, the official story would be that they had succumbed to the flu, their terrifying experience erased from history. He sat down with a pen and a few sheets of paper, and in a hurried, desperate scrawl, he wrote a letter to his brother in St. Louis. He detailed everything: Samuel's horrifying discovery, the strange symbols, the sheriff's threat, Abernathy's silent watch. He described the animal-headed men and his fear of the coming blood moon. He sealed the letter, intending to post it from the next town they reached, a town far from the grasping influence of Blackwood Creek. It was a document that would become one of the most disturbing and forbidden artifacts in the history of the Ozarks, a final testament from a family on the brink of oblivion. And if you're finding this descent into the macabre secrets of the past compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. The hidden histories we unearth are often more horrifying than any fiction, and the final truth of the Sawyer family is a cold case that grows darker with every uncovered detail. As night fell, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in from the hollows, blanketing the farm in a damp gray shroud. The world outside their windows dissolved into an amorphous blur, muffling all sound. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of their own hearts. Jedediah finished his letter, his hand shaking so badly that his writing was barely legible. He tucked it inside his coat, a desperate message in a bottle cast into an ocean of dread. The plan was simple: wait until the deepest point of the night, around 2 in the morning, when even the most vigilant watcher might be asleep, and then make a run for it. They would take the old logging trail that bypassed Blackwood Creek entirely, a rough and difficult path, but one that offered their only chance of escape. They sat together in the main room, the three of them, huddled for warmth and comfort around the dying embers in the hearth. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Samuel, exhausted by fear, eventually fell into a troubled sleep in his mother's arms. Alara hummed a quiet, broken lullaby, her eyes darting towards the fog-shrouded windows at every imagined sound. Jedediah sat with his rifle across his lap, his knuckles white, his senses on high alert. He was no longer a farmer. He was a sentry, guarding his family against a nameless, faceless evil that lurked just beyond the walls of his home. Around midnight, a new sound began to permeate the fog. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was a sound that vibrated in the bones, a guttural, inhuman cadence that rose and fell with the pulse of the earth. Jedediah's blood turned to ice. They hadn't needed to wait for the Sawyers to make a run for it. They were coming for them. The ritual was beginning, and the Sawyer family was an integral, horrifying part of the ceremony. The hunt had begun. The chanting grew louder, closer. It was accompanied by the rhythmic beat of a single, deep-toned drum, a sound like a monstrous heartbeat echoing through the fog. Jedediah rushed to the window, peering out into the swirling gray mist. He could see nothing, but the sound was all around them, a suffocating wave of malevolent energy. Panic seized him. The plan to escape was now impossible. They were surrounded. He turned to Alara, his face grim. "Bar the door." "Put the table against it," he commanded, his voice a harsh whisper. "Take Samuel to the bedroom. Stay away from the windows." Alara, her face a mask of terror, did as he said, her hands trembling as she and Jedediah shoved the heavy oak table against the front door. The chanting outside swelled, the voices multiplying, a chorus of dark prayer. Then through the fog they saw them. Torches. Dozens of them appearing as hazy, orange orbs of light floating in the gray void that surrounded their home. They were moving in a slow, deliberate circle around the farmhouse, tightening the noose. The unseen chanters were closing in. Samuel awoke with a sharp cry, terrified by the noise and the palpable fear that filled the room. Alara swept him up and carried him into the small back bedroom, whispering soothing words that were betrayed by the tremor in her own voice. Jedediah stood in the center of the main room, rifle raised, a lone defender against a besieging army of phantoms. He could hear their footsteps now, the soft tread of many feet on the damp earth. The drumming hopped, the chanting stopped. An even more terrifying silence descended, pregnant with imminent violence. A single sharp rap echoed from the front door, not a knock of inquiry but a knock of command. Then a voice, distorted and low, cut through the night. It was Sheriff Beaumont. "Jedediah Sawyer, open this door. The elders wish to speak with you. No one needs to get hurt." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it was almost laughable. The law was not here to serve and protect. The law was leading the mob. Jedediah's mind raced. Trapped. There was no way out. The sheriff's voice was a clear indication that the entire power structure of the community was arrayed against them. To surrender was to place his family in the hands of the very monsters from his son's drawings. To resist seemed futile, a final, bloody act of defiance that would end only one way. He made his choice. "Get away from my home," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "I'm armed and I'll shoot the first man who tries to come through that door." A low chuckle came from outside, a sound devoid of all humor. "That would be a mistake, Jedediah," Beaumont's voice replied, calm and curt. "A grave mistake." Then the assault began. It was not a chaotic rush but a coordinated, methodical attack. A heavy object slammed against the front door, the wood groaning in protest. Another blow, and the bar Jedediah had placed across it splintered. At the same time, the windows shattered inwards, glass exploding into the room as figures began to climb through the empty frames. In the flickering torchlight that now illuminated the yard, Jedediah could see them clearly for the first time. They were the men from Samuel's drawings. Local farmers, the blacksmith, the general store owner, men he recognized from Blackwood Creek. But over their faces, they wore grotesque, carved wooden masks, fashioned into the snarling visages of beasts. A stag, a goat, a wild boar. Abernathy, the town elder, wore the mask of a great horned owl, its eyes wide and all-seeing. Sheriff Beaumont, his face bare and impassive, stood behind them, directing the attack with a cold, detached authority. The nightmare had breached the walls. It was real, and it was inside their home. Jedediah fired his rifle, the blast deafening in the small room, but it was a single shot against an overwhelming tide. They swarmed him, their movements silent and practiced, disarming him with brutal efficiency. He was thrown to the floor, the horrifying, masked faces looming over him, their silent judgment absolute. From the bedroom, Alara heard the gunshot, Jedediah's cry of pain, and the sounds of a violent struggle. She clutched Samuel to her chest, the boy sobbing into her shoulder as she backed into the furthest corner of the small room, her mind screaming. The bedroom door flew open with a crash, and two of the masked figures filled the doorway, their monstrous shapes silhouetted against the light from the other room. One wore the grim face of a wolf, the other a raven. They moved towards her, not with angry haste, but with a slow, ritualistic purpose that was somehow even more terrifying. Alara screamed, a raw, primal sound of a mother defending her child. She shielded Samuel with her body, a futile gesture against the inevitable. They seized her, their hands like iron claws, and dragged her from the room. She fought with the desperate strength of a cornered animal, kicking and scratching, but it was useless. Samuel was pulled from her grasp, his small hands reaching for her as he was lifted into the arms of another masked figure. The last thing Jedediah saw from the floor, through a haze of pain, was his wife and son being carried out of the house and into the foggy, torchlit night. He was then hauled to his feet, his arms pinned behind his back, and forced outside. The scene in the yard was a vision from a fevered dream. The entire clearing was filled with people from Blackwood Creek, at least 50 of them, men and women, their faces either hidden by animal masks or illuminated by the flickering torches with stark, emotionless expressions. They formed a silent procession, a congregation for some unholy church. In the center, Sheriff Beaumont and the elder Abernathy stood waiting. They were being marched towards the woods, towards the very place where Samuel's nightmare had begun. The procession moved with a grim, lockstep rhythm, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot and the muffled sobs of Alara and Samuel. They were lambs being led to a slaughter, and the entire community had turned out to witness the sacrifice. They were forced deep into the woods, following a barely their path that Jedediah had never known existed. The air grew colder, heavier, and the trees seemed to twist into more menacing shapes. Finally, they entered a clearing, and Jedediah's heart stopped. It was exactly as Samuel had drawn it. A circle of ancient, monolithic stones stood like Nt sentinels, and in the center was a large, flat-topped granite boulder, its surface stained with centuries of dark history. The fog swirled around the clearing, but the sky directly above was unnervingly clear, revealing a full moon painted a sickening, coppery red. The blood moon. The townsfolk formed a wide circle around the altar stone, their torchlight casting long, dancing shadows that looked like ghostly specters. Abernathy, the owl-masked elder, stepped forward and raised his hands. The low, guttural chanting began again, the ancient words resonating with a disturbing power in the enclosed space. Jedediah, Alara, and Samuel were forced to their knees before the altar. They were the outsiders, the ones who had seen the forbidden. Their presence was a contamination that had to be ritually purged. What followed was a horrifying perversion of a religious ceremony. Abernathy produced a ceremonial knife, its blade carved from obsidian, black and sharp. He began to speak, his voice amplified and distorted by the wooden mask, telling the story of the pact. He spoke of how their ancestors, generations ago, had made a covenant with the ancient spirit of the hills, a powerful, bloodthirsty entity that demanded sacrifice in exchange for prosperity and protection. It had protected them from blight, from famine, and now, from the purple death that ravaged the world outside their valley. But the pact required secrecy. It required absolute loyalty. And it required blood. The Sawyers, through the innocent eyes of their son, had broken that secrecy. And now they would serve as the offering, their lives used to renew the pact and appease the ancient, hungry god of the Ozark Hills. The cold case of their disappearance was about to be sealed not with their escape, but with their ritualistic annihilation. The official record, penned by Sheriff Beaumont himself, was brief and tragically simple. The Sawyer family, it stated, was believed to have fled the area in the dead of night, likely fearing the influenza outbreak that had claimed several other families nearby. Their abandoned farm was noted, the cold meal on the table attributed to a hasty departure. There was no mention of a struggle, no hint of violence. The report concluded that they had probably headed west, seeking a healthier climate, and their whereabouts were unknown. It was a clean and tidy explanation, a neat little bow tied around a horrifying secret. The town of Blackwood Creek closed ranks, presenting a united, silent front to any outside inquiry, which in the chaos of 1918 was minimal. The world was too preoccupied with war and pandemic to notice one missing family in the remote Ozark Hills. But Jedediah Sawyer's desperate, hastily scribbled letter had survived. Before being taken, as he was being dragged from his home, the letter had slipped from his coat pocket, falling unnoticed onto the muddy floor near the door. The next morning, Silas Kane, the neighbor who first discovered the empty farm, returned. He was a man who, while part of the community, had always kept to its fringes. He was not one of the founding families, not part of the inner circle. He found the letter, read its terrifying contents, and was faced with an impossible choice. To turn it over to Sheriff Beaumont would be a death sentence. To speak of it openly would be suicide. So he did the only thing he could. He hid it. He placed the letter in an old tin box and buried it deep within the stone wall of his own property, a time capsule of terror, waiting for a day when the truth could be safely revealed. For decades, the letter lay hidden, a silent testament to the horrifying cold case of the Sawyer family, while the official story of their flight west became the accepted, if whispered, truth. The forbidden history was buried, but like all things buried in the Ozark soil, it was not truly gone. It was just waiting. Years turned into decades. The Great War ended. The Spanish flu faded into a traumatic memory. The world modernized, but Blackwood Creek remained stubbornly, almost unnaturally, resistant to change. The same founding families, the Abernathys, the Beaumonts, the Cartwrights, continued to hold power, their prosperity seemingly untouched by the Great Depression that crippled the rest of the country. They were an island of stability in a sea of hardship, a fact they attributed to good management and strong community values. But older residents knew the truth. They knew their good fortune was purchased at a terrible price, a debt renewed in secret on certain nights when the moon was right. The story of the Sawyer family faded from memory into legend, a ghost story told to frighten children into behaving. Don't wander too far into the woods, parents would warn, or the animal men will get you just like they got the Sawyers. The tale became divorced from its horrifying reality, a piece of local folklore. The Sawyer farm itself fell into ruin. The roof collapsed, the walls rot. And the forest slowly reclaimed the land, swallowing the evidence of the life that had once been lived there. Treasure hunters and curious teenagers would sometimes venture onto the property, searching for ghosts or lost valuables, but they never found anything but decay and an oppressive sense of sorrow that seemed to hang in the air. The truth of what happened in 1918 remained buried, both literally and figuratively. The collective silence of the town was perfect, a pact of forgetting that was as binding as the original, bloody covenant. But history has a way of leaving indelible stains, and the macabre secret of Blackwood Creek was not destined to stay buried forever. A new generation, one that did not carry the same fear and loyalty as their parents, was about to ask questions that had been banned for over half a century. In 1972, a young, ambitious historian and folklorist from the University of Missouri named Dr. Alastair Finch became fascinated with the unique cultural isolation of the Ozark region. He was particularly interested in the survival of pre-Christian European folk traditions in remote American communities. His research led him to Blackwood Creek, a town that appeared on paper to be a perfect case study, a stable, prosperous community that had remained culturally static for generations. Finch was initially met with a polite but firm wall of resistance. The townspeople were not interested in talking to an outsider about their history or their beliefs. They were friendly on the surface, but their eyes were guarded, their answers to his questions vague and evasive. He was told the town's success was due to hard work and God's grace, a phrase repeated so often it sounded like a rehearsed script. But Finch was a persistent man. He spent weeks in the county courthouse, poring over old records, deeds, and census data. It was there that he first stumbled upon the Sawyer family. He found the deed to their land, their names on the 1917 census, and then, nothing. They simply ceased to exist in the official record. There was no death certificate, no record of them moving away. They had vanished. Intrigued, he found Sheriff Beaumont's original cursory report on their disappearance. The explanation, that they had simply fled the flu, seemed too convenient, too clean. It was a loose thread, and Finch felt a compulsive need to pull on it. His academic curiosity was slowly transforming into the obsession of a cold case detective. He began to seek out the oldest residents, the ones who might remember 1918, hoping that the passage of time had loosened their tongues. He was about to discover that the fear that had sealed the town's lips for over 50 years was still very much alive. Most of the elderly residents of Blackwood Creek refused to speak with Dr. Finch about the Sawyers. The moment he mentioned the name, their faces would become blank masks, and they would suddenly remember an urgent appointment or a chore that needed doing. The name was a key, but it locked doors instead of opening them. However, he eventually found his way to a nursing home in a neighboring county, where he met an old man named Elias Kane. He was the son of Silas Kane, the neighbor who had first discovered the empty Sawyer farm. Elias was in his late 80s, his mind still sharp but his body frail. He had left Blackwood Creek as a young man and had never returned. At first, Elias was as reluctant as the others, but as Finch spoke, showing him the official records and voicing his suspicions, something shifted in the old man's eyes. He saw in Finch not just a curious academic, but someone who might finally bring the truth to light. With a trembling hand, Elias told Finch a story his father had told him on his deathbed, a story of a hidden letter, a terrifying secret, and a promise made. Silas Kane had been haunted his entire life by what he had read in Jedediah Sawyer's final testament. He was too afraid to reveal it while the old guard of Blackwood Creek still held power, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. He had passed the secret of the letter's location to his son, making him swear to one day give it to someone who was not afraid, someone who would see that justice was done. Elias sketched a crude map on a napkin, his hand shaking with the weight of the 54-year-old secret. It was a map to his father's old farmstead, long since abandoned, and to a specific spot in a crumbling stone wall. "My father said it was the most evil thing he'd ever touched," Elias whispered, his voice raspy. "He said it was proof of the devil's work in that valley." Dr. Finch now held the key to unlocking a horrifying cold case that the town had tried to erase from existence. Following the old man's map, Dr. Finch found the ruins of the Kane farmstead. The place was overgrown, the buildings little more than skeletal remains. With a crowbar and a growing sense of anticipation, he located the section of stone wall from the map. He worked for over an hour prying away the heavy, moss-covered stones, his hands raw and bleeding. Finally, his crowbar hit something metallic. He reached into the cavity and pulled out a small, rust-covered tin box. It was heavier than he expected, weighted down by the damp earth and the gravity of its contents. With trembling fingers, he pried open the lid. Inside, preserved in the airtight container, were a few sheets of yellowed paper, covered in the frantic, spidery handwriting of a man writing his own death warrant. It was Jedediah Sawyer's letter. As Finch stood in the ruins of the old farm and read the words written over half a century ago, a profound chill settled over him, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The letter was a raw, unfiltered account of mounting terror. It spoke of Samuel's vision of the animal-headed men, the symbols, the mutilated livestock, the silent intimidation from the town elder and Sheriff Beaumont's chilling warning. It laid bare the entire campaign of psychological warfare that had been waged against the family. Most terrifyingly, Jedediah wrote of his dawning realization about the blood moon and the impending ritual. "They are not just trying to scare us," he wrote, the desperation clear in every stroke of the pen. "They are preparing. I fear they mean to use us as some kind of sacrifice to their heathen god. If we do not escape tonight, know that we did not fall to sickness. We were taken by the monsters of Blackwood Creek." Finch held in his hands a first-hand account of the crime, a voice from the grave that directly accused the town's most prominent figures of a conspiracy so macabre, so horrifying, it defied belief. The cold case was now blazing hot. Dr. Finch was an academic, not an activist. His first instinct was to handle this discovery through proper channels. He took the letter, along with his own extensive research notes, to the current county sheriff, a man who was, unsurprisingly, a grandson of one of the families Jedediah had implicitly named in his letter, though not a Beaumont or an Abernathy. The sheriff listened to Finch's story, read the letter with a practiced and unreadable expression, and then handed it back. "This is a fascinating piece of local folklore, Doctor," the sheriff said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But it's not evidence of anything. It's the 50-year-old ramblings of a man who was likely suffering from paranoia, possibly brought on by the stress of the pandemic." Finch was stunned. He pointed to the specificity of the accusations, the names, the dates. The sheriff merely shrugged. "Ahernathy and Beaumont have been dead for 30 years. There are no bodies. There is no crime scene. All you have is a ghost story written on a piece of paper. I suggest you go back to your university and write your book, but I would be very careful about what you choose to publish. Blackwood Creek values its privacy." The threat was unspoken but crystal clear. The conspiracy of silence was still in effect, the town's secrets still protected by the descendants of those who had committed the original, horrifying crime. Finch left the sheriff's office realizing the terrifying truth. The system was not broken. It was designed to work this way. The power structure that had murdered the Sawyer family was still firmly in place. Publishing the letter now, without more proof, would not only be professional suicide but could also be physically dangerous. He had uncovered a hornet's nest, and he had just poked it with a stick. He was now an outsider who knew too much, just like the Sawyers. Frustrated and unnerved, Dr. Finch decided to take a different approach. If he couldn't get justice through the law, he would find it in the truth, however he could unearth it. The key, he realized, was the site of the ritual itself. If he could find the stone circle Jedediah's letter alluded to, he might find physical evidence, something more tangible than a 50-year-old letter. He began a systematic search of the woods surrounding the old Sawyer property, using old survey maps and his knowledge of pagan ritual sites, which often occupied places of natural significance, like hilltops or springs. It was a daunting task. The Ozark wilderness was vast and unforgiving. He spent days hiking through dense undergrowth, battling insects and the creeping sense that he was being watched. The woods around Blackwood Creek seemed to have an oppressive quality, a lingering malevolence that he couldn't shake. He started to understand the primal fear the Sawyers must have felt. On the fourth day of his search, he found it. Hidden in a deep, secluded hollow, far from any marked trail, was the clearing. It was just as the letter and the child's drawing had described. A circle of moss-covered, monolithic stones, clearly ancient and not of natural formation. And in the center, the large, flat granite altar. Its surface was weathered and cracked, but Finch could still see faint, dark stains that had soaked deep into the porous rock over centuries of use. It was a place of palpable evil. He began a careful archaeological survey of the site. Using a small trowel, he carefully excavated the soil around the base of the altar. It didn't take long to find something. Just a few inches down, his trowel scraped against something small and metallic. He carefully brushed away the dirt and unearthed a small, tarnished tin soldier. It was identical to the one Silas Kane had described seeing on the floor of the Sawyer farmhouse the day they were discovered missing. It was Samuel's. The boy had dropped it, or placed it there, a final, tiny marker of his presence at the heart of the nightmare. The discovery of the tin soldier was a watershed moment for Dr. Finch. It was the physical link, the tangible proof that connected the Sawyer family directly to this horrifying, sacrificial site. This was no longer just folklore. It was a murder scene. He continued his careful excavation, his excitement tempered by a growing sense of dread. He found other items buried in the soft earth around the altar. A woman's simple silver locket, tarnished and empty, which he presumed belonged to Alara. And then something more disturbing. Fragments of bone. They were small and brittle with age, and he couldn't be certain if they were human or animal without proper analysis. But their presence in this specific location was deeply sinister. He meticulously documented everything, taking photographs and making detailed sketches of the site and the artifacts. He knew he was standing on forbidden ground, desecrating a place that the town's most powerful families considered sacred. The feeling of being watched intensified, and several times he thought he heard the snap of a twig just beyond the clearing, or saw a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. He worked with a frantic urgency, aware that he was a trespasser and that his time was running out. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows through the stone circle, he packed up his findings. He knew he couldn't go back to the sheriff. He was on his own. He had to get this evidence to someone outside the suffocating influence of Blackwood Creek. As he hiked back to his car in the twilight, a sense of profound paranoia clung to him. Every shadow seemed to hold a figure. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered threat. He had done more than just solve a 50-year-old cold case. He had trespassed upon a living religion, a dark faith that had been protected by violence and silence for generations. And now, its followers knew he had found their sanctum. The hunt that had ended the Sawyer family was about to begin anew, with him as the quarry. Dr. Finch drove through the night, not stopping until he was 100 miles away from Blackwood Creek. He checked into a nondescript motel, locked the door, and bolted a chair underneath the handle for good measure. His heart was still pounding in his chest. He laid out the artifacts on the cheap motel bedspread. Jedediah's letter, the tin soldier, the locket, the bone fragments sealed in a plastic bag, and his rolls of film. It was the complete, horrifying story of the boy who saw too much and the family that paid the ultimate price. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't trust law enforcement, so he would turn to the press. The next morning, he contacted a trusted colleague in the journalism department at his university, who in turn put him in touch with a respected investigative reporter from a major St. Louis newspaper. The reporter, initially skeptical, was quickly convinced by the overwhelming evidence Finch presented. The story was explosive: a modern-day pagan cult, generational conspiracies, and a horrifying cold case murder of an entire family. The newspaper began its own discreet investigation, corroborating Finch's findings, checking old records, and discovering a disturbing pattern of accidental deaths and disappearances around Blackwood Creek that stretched back over a century, often coinciding with periods of regional hardship, like droughts or economic downturns. It was a pattern of ritual sacrifice, hidden in plain sight. The newspaper decided to run the story as a multi-part series, a massive exposé that would blow the lid off the town's dark secret. They prepared for the fallout, understanding that they were about to accuse the descendants of the town's founding families of perpetuating a murderous cult. It was a story so macabre, so unbelievable, that it was destined to make national headlines. The secret of Blackwood Creek was about to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. And if you want to support our deep dives into these forbidden histories, a subscription to this channel allows us to keep uncovering stories that have been deliberately buried. What happened next in Blackwood Creek is a testament to how violently the darkness pushes back against the light. The exposé hit like a bombshell. The first article, published on a Sunday, featured a full transcript of Jedediah Sawyer's letter, alongside a grainy photograph of the tin soldier. The headline was stark: "The Ozarks Sacrifice. A 1918 cold case exposes a century of murder in a Missouri town." The story was immediately picked up by national news wires. Blackwood Creek was besieged by reporters, television crews, and curiosity seekers. The town that had so valued its privacy was now under a microscope, its darkest secret laid bare for the world to see. The reaction from the townspeople was swift and furious. Led by the current Mayor Abernathy and Sheriff Beaumont, descendants of the men named in the original crime, they presented a united front of outrage and denial. They claimed it was a smear campaign, a fabrication concocted by a fame-seeking academic and a sensationalist newspaper. They painted Dr. Finch as a villain, a man who had desecrated their ancestors' memory. They filed lawsuits for defamation and libel, but behind the public outrage there was panic. State police, pressured by the media firestorm, were forced to open a formal investigation. They descended on the town, a presence that was deeply resented by the locals. They cordoned off the ritual site in the woods, confirming the existence of the altar and the stone circle. Forensic teams began a thorough excavation of the site, a process that would take weeks. Dr. Finch, now under police protection, became a pariah. He received death threats. His office at the university was vandalized. He was a man who had told a truth so horrifying that many people simply refused to believe it, while others wanted him silenced for daring to speak it at all. He had solved the mystery of the Sawyer family, but in doing so, he had started a war with a community bound by a covenant of blood and silence. The state police investigation confirmed many of Dr. Finch's findings. The bone fragments found near the altar were identified as human, though they were too old and degraded to be definitively identified through the technology of the time. However, the locket was traced back to a St. Louis jeweler who had sold an identical piece to a man matching Jedediah Sawyer's description in 1916. The evidence was circumstantial, but deeply compelling. The most significant breakthrough came from the excavation of the wider area around the stone circle. The forensic team discovered what appeared to be a burial ground. It was not a formal cemetery, but a series of unmarked graves scattered throughout the woods. They unearthed the skeletal remains of dozens of individuals, dating back through the decades, even into the 19th century. Many of the remains showed signs of violence or ritualistic killing. It was a secret graveyard of the cult's victims, the offerings that had ensured the town's prosperity for over 150 years. The Sawyer family, it turned out, were not the first, nor were they the last. They were simply the only ones whose story had a voice, thanks to Jedediah's letter and Samuel's drawings. Faced with this overwhelming physical evidence, the town's wall of silence began to crack. A few elderly residents, their consciences weighed down by a lifetime of guilt and fear, came forward and gave anonymous testimony. They spoke of the old ways, of the society known as the Keepers of the Grove, and of the rituals that were performed to keep the land sweet. They confirmed that the town's leadership had always been drawn from the same founding families, who passed the dark secrets from one generation to the next. The horrifying truth was undeniable. Blackwood Creek was home to a murderous cult that had operated with impunity for more than a century. The cold case of the boy who saw too much had exposed a legacy of evil beyond anyone's darkest imagination. Despite the mountain of evidence and the anonymous testimony, securing a criminal conviction was nearly impossible. The primary suspects, the men who had led the ritual in 1918, were long dead. Their descendants, including the current mayor and sheriff, could not be directly tied to the historical crimes. They claimed ignorance, arguing that the sins of their ancestors were not their own. They portrayed themselves as victims, their family names unfairly tarnished by the dark deeds of a bygone era. The cult, they insisted, had died out with the old generation. The state was able to secure a few convictions on lesser charges, obstruction of justice, perjury, for some of the town officials who had lied during the investigation. But there was no grand trial for the murder of the Sawyer family. There was no justice for the dozens of other victims unearthed in the woods. The core of the conspiracy remained intact, protected by the passage of time and the power of their legacy. The national media eventually moved on to the next sensational story. The state police packed up and left. Blackwood Creek was left to grapple with its exposed shame. The town became a dark tourist attraction for a while, a place of morbid curiosity. But eventually, even that faded. The town retreated back into its shell, more insular and suspicious of outsiders than ever before. Dr. Finch published his book, The Blood Pact of the Ozarks, which became a bestseller in the true crime genre, but his academic career was effectively over. He was seen as a sensationalist, a folklorist who had crossed the line into investigative journalism. He had told the truth, but it had cost him his reputation. The Sawyer family's horrifying story was finally told, their names cleared from the fiction of having abandoned their home. But the evil that had consumed them was never truly vanquished. It had merely retreated back into the shadows of the hills, wounded but not destroyed, waiting to be forgotten once more. The final, and perhaps most disturbing, chapter of this macabre tale did not unfold until decades later in the early 2000s. A new technology, DNA analysis, had become a powerful tool for solving cold cases. A young, determined state detective, intrigued by the legendary Blackwood Creek case, petitioned to have the evidence re-examined. The bone fragments found by Dr. Finch at the altar and the skeletal remains from the secret burial ground were subjected to modern forensic testing. The results were chilling. DNA from the bone fragments found at the altar was a positive match to a distant living relative of Alara Sawyer. It was the final, irrefutable proof that she had been killed at that site. But the analysis of the other remains yielded an even more horrifying discovery. The victims in the burial ground were not all from the distant past. Some were from the 1950s, the 1970s, even as late as the 1980s. They were identified as transients, missing persons and forgotten souls who had had the misfortune of passing through Blackwood Creek at the wrong time. The cult had not died out with the old generation. The rituals, the sacrifices, and the pact had continued long after the Sawyer murders. The town's prosperity through the economic downturns of the late 20th century suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. The denials of the town's leaders in the 1970s were revealed to be not just a cover-up of historical crimes, but an active concealment of ongoing atrocities. The animal masks were not just a historical curiosity. They were likely still being worn by the sons and grandsons of the men who had murdered the Sawyer family. The horrifying truth was that the boy who saw too much hadn't just stumbled upon a single, terrible crime. He had stumbled upon a continuous, living tradition of human sacrifice, a machine of death that had been grinding away in the dark heart of the Ozarks for centuries. This new evidence prompted a new, far more serious investigation. This time, the FBI was involved. They descended upon Blackwood Creek with a conviction that the previous investigation had lacked. They were not investigating a historical crime. They were investigating an active serial-killing conspiracy. But the town was prepared. Decades of practice had perfected their methods of silence and concealment. There were no more letters to be found, no more talkative old men in nursing homes. The community was a fortress, its walls built of fear and generational loyalty. The FBI agents were met with open hostility and a campaign of silent, unnerving intimidation that mirrored what the Sawyer family had experienced nearly a century earlier. Their tires were slashed in the night. Dead animals were left on their doorsteps. They were followed, their every move watched by the cold, resentful eyes of the townspeople. The leaders of the community, the direct descendants of the original keepers of the grove, used their wealth and influence to hire powerful legal teams, bogging the investigation down in a quagmire of motions and legal challenges. They painted the FBI as a tyrannical force persecuting a small, traditional community based on old legends and flimsy evidence. The investigation stalled. Without a confession, without a witness willing to break the code of silence, they could not move forward. The DNA proved that murders had occurred, but it could not point to the specific individuals who had committed them. The cult, it seemed, was untouchable, protected by a modern legal system just as effectively as it had been by the isolation of the past. The case of the Sawyer family had been solved, but the dark entity behind their deaths remained a phantom, a living, breathing curse on the land. The story of Samuel Sawyer, the boy who saw too much, serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can fester in isolated places. His innocent curiosity peeled back the veneer of civility on a community and exposed the primordial evil that lay beneath. The horrifying details of his family's final hours are a testament to the terrifying power of belief and the brutal lengths people will go to in order to probe. See their secrets. The case is a macabre tapestry woven from many threads: the paranoia of the 1918 pandemic, the deep-seated folk traditions of the Ozarks, and the universal fear of the unknown that lurks just beyond the firelight. Samuel's charcoal drawing, a piece of evidence initially dismissed as childish fantasy, turned out to be the most accurate and honest testimony of the entire affair. It was a window into a hidden world, a world of blood pacts and animal-headed men, a world that should only exist in the darkest of fairy tales, but was horrifyingly real in the hollows of Missouri. The tin soldier, found decades later at the site of the sacrifice, is a heartbreaking symbol of the innocence that was destroyed that night. A small piece of a normal childhood, left behind in a place of unimaginable horror. It connects the legend back to the little boy at its heart, a child who paid the ultimate price for a single, accidental glimpse of a forbidden truth. It stands as a memorial, not just for the Sawyer family, but for all the unnamed victims whose bones were consecrated to the hungry god of the grove, their lives erased to ensure the prosperity of a town built on a foundation of murder. The official case files may be closed, but the story is far from over. What is the state of Blackwood Creek today? If you were to visit, you would find a quiet, picturesque town that seems to have been plucked from a postcard. The storefronts on Main Street are neatly painted, the church steeple is pristine, and the people are outwardly friendly, if a bit reserved. The town is surprisingly prosperous, its local economy thriving even as other rural communities struggle. The Abernathy family still owns the largest tracts of land, and Beaumont is still a prominent figure in local politics. To an outsider, it is the very picture of American pastoral success. But if you look closely, you might notice the strange, almost protective symbols carved discreetly into the doorframes of the older homes. You might feel the weight of eyes on your back as you, an outsider, walk down the street. If you were to ask about the Sawyer family or the unpleasantness of the 1970s, you would be met with a cold, impenetrable silence. The town has not forgotten. It has simply perfected the art of hiding its scars and its secrets. The woods surrounding the town are now almost entirely private property, owned by the founding families and posted with aggressive, no trespassing signs. The stone circle, the altar, is now inaccessible, its location a closely guarded secret, erased from any modern maps. The town has deliberately and systematically cut itself off, ensuring that no one can ever again stumble upon its sanctum. The cult, the keepers of the grove, almost certainly still exists. It has not been vanquished, it has evolved. It has adapted its methods to the modern world, becoming more careful, more secretive, its influence hidden behind layers of wealth, political power, and legal protection. The pact, it seems, is still in effect. The most chilling aspect of this cold case is the implication that the cycle is not over. The pact, as described by the old legends and Jedediah's letter, was a covenant that required periodic renewal. It was a debt that had to be paid in blood to keep disaster at bay. In 1918, the offering was made to ward off the Spanish flu and the hardships of war. The evidence of victims from the 50s, 70s, and 80s suggests renewals were made during other times of national or global crisis. This raises a disturbing, horrifying question. In our own modern era, with its own unique set of crises, its own pandemics, economic uncertainties, and social upheavals, have new offerings been made? Has the debt been paid anew? When you look at the National Registry of Missing Persons, there are countless individuals who have vanished without a trace, their last known location often a lonely stretch of highway or a remote rural area. How many of them had the misfortune of running out of gas near Blackwood Creek? How many were unfortunate drifters who were lured in by the promise of a meal or a day's work, only to become the centerpiece of a horrifying ritual under a blood moon? The Sawyer family's case was solved only because of a series of miracles. A brave boy who drew what he saw, a desperate father who wrote a letter, and a guilty neighbor who hid it. Without that letter, the Sawyers would simply be three more names on a long, forgotten list of the vanished, their horrifying fate known only to their killers and the ancient, malevolent entity in the hills. The legacy of this case is one of enduring mystery and profound dread. It demonstrates that not all monsters are creatures of fantasy. Some wear the faces of our neighbors. They are pillars of their community, their hands stained with the blood of secrets passed down through generations. They are the smiling shopkeeper, the firm but fair sheriff, the respected town elder. This is the ultimate horror of Blackwood Creek. The evil was not an external force that invaded the town, but the very foundation upon which the town was built. It was a conscious choice, a deal made with darkness for the sake of earthly prosperity. The story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about history, that the official record is often a carefully constructed fiction, written by the victors or, in this case, by the conspirators. The real, macabre truths are often buried in unmarked graves, hidden in rusty tin boxes, or whispered in the frantic drawings of a terrified child. The boy who saw too much has become a permanent part of the dark folklore of the Ozarks. Samuel Sawyer is a ghost, a cautionary tale, a symbol of innocence sacrificed at the altar of a dark tradition. His story lingers in the deep hollows and the shadowed ridges, a permanent stain on the landscape. The questions that remain are as chilling as the facts we know. How many other victims are buried in those woods, their stories untold, their names forgotten? How many other communities across the world are hiding similar pacts, similar secrets? The horrifying truth is, we will never know. The silence that protects Blackwood Creek is a silence that has been perfected over centuries. It is a silence that is stronger than any investigation, and it is a silence that will, undoubtedly, be broken again by the screams of the next offering. Perhaps the most macabre element of this entire cold case is the artifact that started it all, the child's drawing. After the investigations, it was placed in a university archive, a piece of historical evidence. But those who have seen it, who have looked into the simple charcoal lines, report a strange, unsettling feeling. The drawing is more than a depiction of a memory. It feels like a conduit, a window into the event itself. Some have claimed to feel a palpable coldness emanating from the paper. Others have reported having vivid nightmares after viewing it, dreams of guttural chanting and the blank, wooden eyes of animal masks. It is as if some of the residual terror of that night, some of the psychic energy of the ritual, was captured on the page by Samuel's hand. It is a forbidden object, a document that tells a story that was banned by its own community. It serves as the final, silent testimony of the boy who saw too much. His eyes saw the horror, his hand recorded it, and that record survived to tell a truth that an entire town conspired to bury. The drawing is a curse upon the memory of Blackwood Creek, a permanent indictment that cannot be erased by legal maneuvers or threats of violence. It is the ghost of Samuel Sawyer, reaching across the decades to point an accusing finger from the grave. It ensures that what happened to his family will never be truly forgotten, even as the town that murdered them tries desperately to erase the memory from the face of the earth. In the end, the case of the Sawyer family remains a horrifying open wound on the soul of the Ozarks. While we know what happened, there has been no true justice. The perpetrators are dead, their descendants protected by law and legacy, and the cult that spawned them remains hidden, a venomous snake coiled in the deep grass of the Missouri hills. The story serves as a stark warning that the past is never truly dead. It sleeps, it waits, and sometimes it continues its grim work in the shadows, unnoticed by the modern world. The next time you drive through a remote, quiet town that seems just a little too perfect, a little too prosperous, ask yourself what secrets its foundations are built upon. What pacts were made in the deep woods generations ago? And what price is still being paid to maintain that peace? Because somewhere in the dark hollows of America, another child might be peering through the trees, seeing something they were never meant to see. And a new, horrifying cold case is waiting to be born from the silence of those who will do anything, absolutely anything, to protect their forbidden, macabre traditions. The boy saw too much, and the hills remember, and they are always, always hungry.